Welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast, conversations to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. An uplifting and inspiring series of conversations and talks with your host, Jackie Woodside. We are educating minds, empowering lives, and enlightening souls to create a world where love prevails. In this engaging podcast, we deliver exciting, positive, transformative talks and teachings designed to elevate your life. Now, let's join our host, Jackie Woodside, for this week's session.
Hello there. Thank you again for being with us for another episode of the Conscious Living Podcast, where we are here to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. I'm Jackie Woodside, the founder and the host of this podcast, and I want to thank you for being with us today and being one of those people that cares about creating a more conscious world. I so appreciate that about you, and that we share that value and that we can be a part of one another's tribe. So I love exploring all of the different avenues of life that we can really dive in more deeply and live more consciously. And one of those that is near and dear to my heart, but that I honestly don't bring enough to this podcast, is the area of leadership. So I'm grateful today to be working with my colleague, Ellen Petry Leanse, who will be sharing with us her thoughts on leadership, neuroscience, how the brain leads us to create our experiences, and how we can create the brain. So this is going to be a fascinating episode. And Ellen, thank you for being with us. Do you mind just saying a bit more about yourself and your journey so our listeners can get to know you a little bit more?
Absolutely. And such a pleasure to be here. And Jackie, I loved how you said how we can create our brain, because if there's one takeaway I would love for your listeners to have from this episode, it is that the brain is our tool, yet left to itself, and I consider left to itself very important words in neuroscience. The brain will make us feel like we are.
Absolutely.
And I'm all about inverting that power dynamic, because trust me, it's better for us, and it actually turns out to be much better for the brain. So thrilled. Very briefly, my journey has kind of been like the two hemispheres of the brain. I've had the linear pursuit of a traditional career in technology, having worked at early Apple, at Google, been a consultant, advisor, and coach to all kinds of other well-known tech companies. And I've also been an entrepreneur with my own startups. That's very left hemispheric, and we live in an increasingly, and sometimes I think almost dangerously, left hemispheric world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole other part of my life, and it has to do with the realm of art and beauty and creativity and experience, which is very much associated with the right hemisphere. However, the most important thing about that is that the right hemisphere sees big picture patterns and really looks across the course of the lifetime to say, this is what actually is happening and makes sense.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that brings me here, because the fusion of those two things and the balancing of those two hemispheric capabilities really brings me to the point where, at this point in my life, more than ever, I believe this is all about consciousness and our gift of incarnation as a way of living in consciousness, learning what consciousness is, and participating in a mystery that is much larger than we will ever understand.
It's so great. I love also teaching and speaking about consciousness. And one of the things that I'm present to is that there doesn't seem to be one agreed upon definition of consciousness in the field of consciousness studies. So I define consciousness as the vibratory pattern created by your inner world, that there is an energy that surrounds us, and that energy changes depending on our beliefs, emotions, attitudes, our thoughts, how we perceive things. It creates an electromagnetic field around you. That's how I define consciousness. I know that's a little bit unique. So I'm curious, before we dive into this deeper talk about the brain and how we can, in my language, use your mind to train your brain. That's the phrase that I use. But how we can use our brain better. Before we dive into that, Ellen, I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts about this whole notion of consciousness and how you understand it.
Well, that could fill the whole podcast. I'll try to be brief.
I could.
Yeah, I love your definition and I love the clarity of it. And I also really appreciate how you predicated it by saying there's there's no fixed definition. I think that's part of the beauty of consciousness. I almost think, if we look at the world of quantum mechanics and we talk about waves and particles, there's consciousness and then there's consciousness observed, and they could be quite different
Could be
things.
different things. Yeah, exactly.
This is my belief, and I've wavered with it over time. I've had very mechanistic or materialistic ways of saying,
Yeah.
oh, the brain simply generates this experience of being incarnate. It's really just nothing more than a model created by the brain. It's not where I am today.
Yeah.
And where I am today is really that all sentient beings, all living forms, and perhaps even depending on, different views of animism and so forth, perhaps even other forms are containers for units of consciousness. It's kind of my kind of casual way of saying it. And that the consciousness is assigned a life experience. In my case, your case, and our listeners' case, most of our listeners, probably some nice dogs out there listening and so forth.
Yeah, right.
I hope they enjoy it too.
Yeah.
But we have an assignment, if you will, to experience what consciousness is like. And some people might even say what the divine is like, if that's what works for them, through the experience of being human. Now, I can tell you right now, I have no way to tell you if that could ever be validated, if that's right or wrong, true or false. We do love in this left hemispheric world a good binary. It's good,
Yes.
it's bad, it's everything like
Yeah.
that. I have no idea, and I've decided not to care. And my motto when it comes to thinking about embodying what I see as consciousness, I say, what if, as if? What if what I said were actually valid, worth thinking about? I don't want to say true. That seems a little too finite to me. But what if really I am just an expression of consciousness having a human experience?
Mm.
And I can live as if I am. So what if that were true? Then how do I live as if it were true? And I will tell you, in that very simple structure, I have found tremendous satisfaction, joy, and alignment with purpose in my life.
Ellen, that's a brilliant phrase. I share a similar view that I don't know if the beliefs that I've cultivated about consciousness and conscious living and personal growth, spiritual growth, I don't know if any of it is true, but it empowers my experience of life. Therefore, I choose to act as if it is true, and dedicate my life to it. So I love that very simple phrasing that you have boiled it down to. What if, as if, what if it's true, and how can I live as if it were? So I think that is a brilliant way of touching on that. You said something earlier that I don't know if you're going to want to go here, and if you don't, you can just say so, because this is not part of what we talked about covering today. But it's something I'm super interested in, and something that I think is pretty rare in kind of common media today. You said that you used to subscribe to the materialistic view of the brain and consciousness. And because I'm also a neuroscience and spirituality geek, I know the material versus the non-materialistic view of the brain, and that there's a whole field of thought around that. I've never delved into it in any of my courses or on this podcast, but if you're game, I'd be curious for us to have just a high-level discussion about these two paradigms, if you will, the material view of the brain and the non-materialistic view of the brain, and share your thoughts about that.
Oh, I'd love to. And I find cross-training between the two has been such a gift. And I think that's something for all of us to remember. I mean, part of the gift of thinking materialistically about the brain, and for people who aren't familiar with the term, because once upon a time I wasn't either, it's really almost the computer model of the brain where, there are different programs running. And sure enough, there are chemical and electric programs running in the brain at all times that are kind of creating our perception of and response to whatever is happening out there in external objective reality, and also our response within our own internal reality. So if you hear people say a materialistic or mechanistic view of the brain, that's probably more or less what they're talking about, that it's almost like it's a technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen in the last 15 to 20 years, maybe you have too, Jackie, but a real rise it's a very interesting thing. I've watched in traditional neuroscience communities, or more like strictly neuroscientific communities, an increasing focus on materialism or mechanistic views of the brain. And as we know more, haha, air quotes, know more, because there's still so much more to learn about the brain, it becomes really easy to say, okay, this function is running and this function is running. And then, really the computer analogy is excellent. I've used it myself. Where I leave the materialistic and mechanistic world, and where some of my friends in neuroscience get very, very angry with me, is we go on and on about this sort of technology metaphor, and it works really well until I ask one question. Okay, great. And where does it plug into a power source? And then the whole thing kind of pops, right? It doesn't make as much sense anymore. This is where I come back to something of consciousness that is larger than we will ever understand, and that is more than simply this incarnate way of being human. However, I want to say there have been times where going to a purely mechanistic view has been really, really helpful for me. And in fact, in one important event in my life, I went in saying, okay, I'm going to run this experiment, and I am equally excited about either outcome. If it tells me that I'm generating this whole experience intrinsically, endogenously within my own brain, that it's just a hologram or a fabrication or something like that, that I have created, I am the dream, life is the dream, then wow, awesome, that's going to be so cool. Yet if what I feel I do in this experiment is really leave that realm, and by the way, I could come up for that first scenario with a really interesting right hemispheric perspective on how we're generating that from sort of, I don't know, something that's been etched into us since the dawn of time, whatever that might be, but is very much biological. I hope I'm making sense here because it's kind of out there stuff.
It's
But
good.
then the other thing is, no, what if this experiment is simply letting me kind of soften the boundaries between all that I know, and those were air quotes you just heard there, all that I know and all that is, so that I actually gain a different level of access. And I came back from that experiment going, there's no difference. It's like a wave and a particle. What is the difference?
So fascinating.
It was so cool.
Would you mind deepening, by way of definition, more the non-material view of the brain, and say more about what that is, and what contemporary thinkers are saying about that now?
Yeah, I'm going to try my very best, and it's hard stuff to put into
It
words.
is.
Yeah, it has to do with the things you've already touched on across this podcast, Jackie, and even here. And that is really, we are expressions of consciousness on some level. There are many books that have been written from thousands and thousands of years ago, and even the experience that the Buddha had during enlightenment, and, then also some very contemporary spiritual works are really talking about how we are sort of facets of something more, facets of, we might call it consciousness on this podcast. We might call it the divine in spiritual texts. We might call it great mystery, or all that is, in various forms of indigenous knowledge systems. So if we are, you talked about consciousness largely as an internal experience. I look at it as a very permeable experience where we are actually much more connected to a larger realm than we are aware of. And that could be through time and through space, whole other topic there. However, I believe the brain is actually a filtering device that learns to be human by filtering out certain levels of access to that experience of, non-duality, or whatever you might call it, in service of keeping this human form alive. If we didn't filter out some of the things that are probably our birthright of connection to the divine, connection to the vast, connection to consciousness, we would be less functional as human beings. We have a job to do here as humans that is about our survival.
Yeah.
The brain, above all, is an organ that is charged with keeping us alive, ideally safe and alive, but safety gets into a whole different topic because, there are a lot of things that the brain will tolerate in terms of repetitive behavior patterns or certain types of limiting thoughts that actually aren't safe, but the brain will generate those again and again because, based on its experience, we're still alive, so everything has gone perfectly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
So,
I like to say the brain is designed for us to survive, not for us to thrive.
Mhm.
Do you agree with that?
I could get very pedantic and I'd have to think about it. It
Okay.
is designed for us to survive. I think it can also be designed for us to thrive, yet
Okay.
only when there's an inversion where we
Yes,
claim it
where we
as
could.
our tool.
Right. So there's the neurology of the brain and what the brain is designed to do, like you said, to keep us alive. And then there's the psychology where the ego gets involved. And that's where I kind of say the two of these combine, where if the ego, the psychological mechanism of the ego feels threatened, feels like it might be embarrassed or shamed or made wrong or marginalized, there is this very natural human tendency to say, mm-mm, not doing that. Or if
Oh,
there
yeah.
has been a psychic injury, to say, oh, not doing that again. So that over the untrained mind, the untrained consciousness over one's lifetime, I feel very easily becomes smaller because of repeated injuries or narcissistic
Beautiful.
wounds that has one say, oh, nope, not doing that one again. Oh, nope, not doing that one again. Or worse, perhaps, becoming kind of living in victim consciousness of, well, this happened to me and that happened to me. So
Right.
that's what I mean when I say,
I'm with you all the way. And by the way, if since you asked me what I thought, if you preceded what you said with left to itself,
yes,
the
left
then
to
I
its own
wrote
devices.
exactly
Yes,
100%.
yes,
Because
that is
really,
how I mean it.
it
The
is. And
untrained
are you so
brain, the untrained consciousness, that it is designed to keep you alive.
100%. And I love how you talked about that left to itself, there's almost a reductionist nature to the brain where, it will A/B test all kinds of experiences and then compress the realm of possibility based on avoiding threat to
Yeah.
the ego, the identity, or of course survival.
Or
But in
survival of the body,
yeah,
sure, sure.
brava, then I'm all with you.
Yeah, okay, good, good. This is so fascinating. So we're talking a lot. Again, I say use the mind to train the brain. What's the phrase that you've used about using your brain? Is that how you use your brain? Is that yours?
I think the one that I talk about is I often say that left to itself, the brain will
Left
make
to
us its tool
Yes.
until we make
Yes.
it
So
our
how
tool.
you can use the brain as a tool rather than be used by it. Yeah,
Beautiful.
one of the
Yes.
phrases I often use is your thoughts are thinking you.
But it's a perfect phrase. You're right.
Your thought, again, the untrained consciousness, the untrained mind, your thoughts are thinking you. Let's go here a little bit about how to turn that around. But I want to preface it just with an example so people can really presence this in their own experience. So that's where I want to go next, is how we make that shift so that we use the brain as a tool rather than the brain living us, so we can actually have our thoughts versus our thoughts thinking me. So just the example to presence it for people so they'll be like, oh, yeah, that happens to me all the time. I totally get that. I recently had an upset with a group of friends where there was a misunderstanding, and some people were saying some unkind things about me. That, by the way, were not true, factual. They weren't factual. Maybe they were true to them, but they were not factual. But anyway, and it got passed around this small group of a community that I'm a part of. And so it came upon me. One of my friends in that community told me about it. And I went to bed that night with a very trained consciousness, mind you. I've been working this stuff and teaching this stuff for 20, 30 years, and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I tried to go to sleep, focus on my breath, and my brain would go right back to it. Relax, say a mantra, and my brain would go right back to it. So we have these places. So I share that not because it was something wrong. I got to sleep within 10 or 15 minutes, and it was able to shift the experience of it. But I share that so people are really, so I want the listener to be like, okay, what is yours? Maybe it's you've got more bills left than there is money at the end of the month. Maybe it's, I went through this myself. Maybe you've got a child with emotional difficulties. There's a plethora of mental health crises going on, particularly with young people. Maybe you've got a child that's, having needs, or an elderly parent that's having needs, and you sometimes just can't get it out of your head.
Yeah.
So Ellen, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, maybe even backing up a little bit. First of all, talk about this notion of the brain as a tool, and then to move it into these more specific areas of, say, mindfulness, say, anxiety or repetitious thoughts that you can't move away from. So I gave you a very big preface, and I'll leave it to you to dive in.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And the first thing that comes up for me is I feel so much empathy these days for many of the challenges and obstacles that seem to be weighing so heavily on so many people. And let's not forget, or let's imagine, what if, as if, that, we are really all co-participants in some sort of collective consciousness. And to some extent, I think we're all experiencing some of the collective pain that really is that exists in this time and in this place and on this planet. I'm often fascinated by long surviving human cultures, land-based, indigenous, and people who have survived a very, very long time in their cultures and their lands. All of them acknowledge that trauma is part of human existence. And sometimes if we look at the way that, tens of thousands of years ago, some of these cultures lived, much more physical hardship than we have to deal with, but they all have processes for acknowledging and releasing trauma so it doesn't accrue generation to generation. And
Beautiful.
we don't have that here. So, we know that
Wow.
genetically and psychologically, trauma is aggregating, and we're at a really hard time right now. The pandemic from a few years back, I think even in many ways it was a gift, because so many of us learned to connect in different ways and found other gifts, pardon me, excuse me, but it was a stress for all of us. Let's just own it, so let's just acknowledge that a lot of hardship is real right now. But Jackie, what your question was about rumination. And it's about the brain really running a cycle that's saying, based on some map of what it thinks it takes for you to survive, it thinks that that's a thought that you need to lock into, which might be a way of the brain saying, I don't know quite how to figure this one out yet because it's still too complex. So I'm going to run a few experiments to see across different networks what I can do. And also, it's activating your future brain. It's having you drill this over as a warning, which it's going to update through the default mode network as you sleep at night and as you have downtime during the day. So I believe that ruminating thoughts that are frightening or dark or diminishing, or that create any sort of, negative emotional charge, are very important to look at. There are three things that I have found that work really well to help disrupt these cycles. I'll bet you know them too. The first one is to breathe. I read a quote only yesterday that said, the difference between excitement and fear is one breath. Not in all scenarios, but in scenarios like if you're going off to do something you've never done before. And by the way, imagine, just envision in your mind, there's a skier at the top of a mountain. They're about to do an incredible run. They want to do it faster than they've ever done. What's the thing they do before they let those skis start moving down the hill? They take a breath. They visualize too, but they take a breath. So breath. The other is, they're both really about examples of expanding out to a bigger picture. And in fact, I'm writing on this right now because of a course I'm developing on optimism and resiliency. But we have to then, when these thoughts are going up, we have to go, what's a bigger thought than this? Like, what's the 30,000-foot view of my life, and how does this fit into it? What is the learning that this rumination is trying to get me to learn? What am I here to learn? This is a hard thing to say, but when I run into a problem, I'll say, all suffering is self-inflicted. I don't necessarily believe it.
Yeah.
But I tell that to myself first. If I'm suffering, it was self-inflicted. And then I put myself through what I call the CPA exam. How did I create, promote, or allow this to happen in my life? And I can almost always go back and say, when so-and-so did or said that, I tolerated it, but it didn't feel right to me, and I still let it go. Cool. What can I learn from that? And if I learn it, how can I apply it to a future where I'm not in a scenario of regret like I am now? So breath, 30,000-foot view. And then sometimes I do this. I kind of go out to a more indigenous way of thinking, a more ancient way of thinking. It goes, this is all part of something much larger than I will ever understand. This little blip, and by the way, I've been in some things that most people wouldn't call little blips. I mean, there have been some times, right? But this in the grand scheme of things, this thing is pretty insignificant.
Mhm.
And how can I work toward a larger perspective so that I put this thing into a fuller context and it doesn't take the control of me that I feel it taking right now? And Jackie, I want to say, this isn't like a thing like, oh, great, now I'm going to do that. This is a practice, and
Yeah.
it works. The more you practice it, the more it works.
Right.
And I know I'll be practicing for the rest of my life because, there are going to be hard times ahead. It's
Sure.
just part of life.
Sure.
But I've come to see it in a larger context where it doesn't lock into me the way I once let
Yeah.
it lock into me.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I love what you just said, that it's not just a technique. I often feel it's not a way, it's not just a tool, it's a way of being. And so it has to be practiced, whatever the it is. This thinking has to be practiced until it becomes your way of being, to automatically take the 30,000-foot view, to automatically be able to reframe what's happening from the minute, right now, heavy impact to, in the grand scheme of things, will I remember this even in 5 weeks, let alone 5 years? So
Right?
let's make that shift now, Ellen, if you will, to talk a little bit more about how we can use our brain as a tool. What are some of the things that you teach so that we're able to turn that around and, if you will, use your mind to train your brain?
Thanks, Jackie. So the first thing, right, it all builds around the word of intention. And some people might say mindset or mindfulness and so forth, and they're all congruent terms.
Yeah.
But an intention is really what you desire. And sometimes it feels more than a desire. It feels like what you yearn for, what you're aching for. In certain practices, they go, well, what would you like? And I think it's much more than that. It's almost they're sort of words, but what does your heart call you to? What does your spirit call you to? And the thing is that the intention is activated in a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is really interesting in a lot of ways. Dr. David Rock of the Neuro Leadership Institute writes about it as the stage director. The thing is, it's only a stage director that can step out on the stage when we will it there. The brain is I like to say the brain is a cheapskate. The entire brain comprises about 3% of the entire adult body mass, yet consumes something like 20% of its energy. It's the hungriest organ in the body. And the prefrontal cortex, which comprises, and for those who are only listening, I'm, waving my hands over my forehead above my eyebrows right now. It's sort of where that thing lives. It is the newest part of the human brain. It evolved most recently. It still evolved a long time ago, but it's the youngest part of the human brain. And it's also the hungriest part of the human brain. As new things generally take more energy than old things. Yeah. And so the brain doesn't like to bring the prefrontal cortex online because it is much more fuel efficient for it to run established routines. Yet for change to happen, we have to engage and activate the prefrontal cortex, also called the PFC. So I like to activate my PFC when I'm looking to intention or planning or seeking an outcome from an experience. I like to do it through visualization, which also recruits from the visual cortex, but I really can almost feel my thoughts move to the front of my brain. And I try to envision something there and have an intention, sometimes an outcome, but very often kind of more of an aspirational experience or feeling that I'm really seeking. And it's funny, even talking to you about it, Jackie, you maybe saw me shut my eyes, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. What I think I was doing, what my body was doing, was cutting off my visual centers, which use a lot of brain energy in order to make more energy, more brain access available to the PFC. Now, there's something fascinating about the PFC, and you know this through your work, your neuroscience, through all the things. When we feel any form of threat, be that threat to survival, is brain survival, or a threat to the identity, the ego, or to something in our expectations, the brain fires a signal, it's often called the amygdala hijack, that sends a chemical cocktail surging through the brain and the body. You feel it in your body as pins and needles, goosebumps, that gut feeling, that triggers, again, there are different theories on this, but the most familiar way to talk about it triggers the fight or flight response. One of the chemical reactions fired in the fight or flight response is it's a vasoconstriction. It's a blood vessel constricting reaction that reduces the flow of blood temporarily to the prefrontal cortex. It literally takes the PFC offline.
Offline, yeah.
And it's diverting energy into the parts of the body associated with fight or flee, even if it was only a sense of being othered. And I shouldn't say only, that can be pretty extreme, but even if it was not a threat to real survival, but yet to the identity or ego.
Yeah.
So there's a clue in that. If the chemical cocktail reduces blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, blood carries glucose and oxygen to the PFC. It's very easy to think that one breath can help bring that PFC back online.
Yeah.
One intentional breath. I feel very grateful. I have nothing to compare this to what my life would be like now if I weren't doing this. But over practice and over training, I have learned, thank you, amazing teachers, thank you, challenging life experiences, to use the breath to keep from being reactive and to come into being more responsive. Now, that doesn't mean I don't lose my temper sometimes. I do. There are times when that's actually good and important. Yet I don't get triggered or feel afraid the way I once did. And for that, I thank the intention of taking better charge of my brain and learning to use the breath as a skill that supports that.
It's beautiful. So using the breath as a way of mastering what's happening in your neurology. Say a couple more, like just one or two more things that people can do starting today, listening to this
I
episode
love it.
to,
I mean,
regulate, to bring themselves back to center.
There's one that's my favorite. So for short term, moving from reaction to response, there's the breath. For general tone of life, there's the setting of intention through values, and a beautiful phrase that I don't remember who shared this with me first, but to really drop into what your values are, you sit with this question and come up with an answer, all listeners, and it's this: the world gets better when.
I
If
love
you
that.
complete that sentence, and very much if you complete it reflectively, come up with what comes to mind first, yet sit with it for a minute and then bring it down as much as you can to a very simple statement. That is an intention for your life that you've just encapsulated there. So
I
that's
love that.
midterm.
The world
And
gets
then,
better when, and just
yeah,
allow yourself to focus on that as a
yeah.
way
Isn't it
of
beautiful?
regulating. Oh, I love it.
It
That's
is. And then that is something I would say it's great to come up with that. And it's absolutely fine to do it once, but it's not going to create change. If you want it to create change, come back to it. Write it, make yourself a little, mood board that has it on it. Write it on a note and pin it to your, magnet it to your refrigerator. Remind yourself, practice. The world gets better when. Watch what happens. Your brain will say, okay, and it'll come to start to align with it.
so
And
beautiful.
then this one is more for long term, and I absolutely love it. If people only knew what their brain did while they were sleeping, their minds would be blown, because really we learn when we're sleeping. That is where the brain goes in and kind of reorganizes the cabinet, if you will, little by little, to prioritize the thoughts that are becoming more important in your life through new experiences and reinforcement of older experiences.
Beautiful.
Falling asleep at night, if you practice these 3 questions and stick with this, because you're going to be amazed at what starts to happen. First, what is something you need to get done tomorrow? Like actually on a fairly tactical level, you have to turn in a report or make sure that you hit all the beats on your schedule, or have an important talk with someone you love, whatever it is. What's an important thing I must do tomorrow? Tell your brain what that is. I need to talk with so-and-so about this, or I need to complete that. State it as what you need to do. Then, what is the tone or the experience I want to have tomorrow? You think, oh, it's going to be a stressful day. I want to stay really centered and grounded as I get through this challenging day, and really go in and feel that. Or I want to be really positive as I go and work with my friend on this thing we're co-creating, or whatever it is. Or I want to stay I don't know, whatever it is, you can come up with it. And then the third thing is, and how does this fit into my long-term vision for my life? So
Mm.
what you're doing is you're
Oh,
bringing to the prefrontal cortex
yeah.
3 really important homework assignments for your brain to do while you sleep.
Mhm.
And while you are sleeping, your brain is actually going to go through and chemically kind of etch away at some of the old synapse sort of related patterns
Mhm.
and start to rebuild neuronal connections that are associated with these new types of thought.
Beautiful.
This updates a lot of stuff in the brain, and it's not a one and done. This is something you habituate as a practice. I will tell you, there was one time when I was first learning this, I was about 2 months into it, and I made this up. Like I just started thinking, okay, if the brain's doing this at night, like how can we skew it toward intentionality? So I started practicing this. I gave it those 3 things to do one night. I slept like a baby. And I woke up the next morning, and it was as if there was a butler standing right there with a silver platter that had a total, like, just like a full serving of solutions just waiting for me for
Mm.
exactly the problem I had to solve the
So
next
great.
morning.
So
I could
great.
not believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
So
love that.
may
And
I add one more very quick thing?
please do. Yes.
First 20 minutes of the day, set your tone for your brain's experience the whole day. There's a shocking number of people, and I have been one of them, who begin their day right away working on their phones.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're doing in those first 20 minutes is you're telling your brain, this is how you need to work today. And it's a very stress elevating way.
Mhm.
My
Mhm.
recommendation is for anyone who's willing to try it for 1 month, simply take the first 20 minutes of your day to do anything other than use technology.
Mm.
Anything. Watch what happens.
Oh, beautiful. I like to, when I wake up in the morning, put my hand on my heart and breathe in love for myself and breathe out love for the world for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes and start my day that way.
You're telling your brain with that first action, okay, I see what matters today. And
Right.
look what it does for you.
Yeah, I have a very peaceful existence throughout my day. Ellen, you
Mhm.
and I could talk all day. Something that makes the world better is people who share similar values having meaningful conversations. Makes the world better. So thank you so, so much. I know people are going to want to look into you, learn more about you, and perhaps look into your services. So where's the best place that people can find your work, Ellen, and get to know you better?
Well, thank you so much. So a good place to start would be my website, which is ellenleanse.com.
Okay.
That's leanse.com. Ellen's pretty obvious. And then also I have a podcast that's called The Brain and Beyond, and you can find that very easily on all of the players and also at its native website, which is thebrainandbeyond.com. And I have 20 episodes there, more to come. Exploring all sorts of different aspects of neuroscience as it applies to real life.
Beautiful. It's just been delightful to have this conversation with you. So I want to thank you again for sharing the depth of wisdom and just how far and wide we were able to go in this short amount of time. I appreciate you.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Jackie.